Welcome to the Design Materials channel. I am Edson Mafuz, architect and professor of architectural design at the School of Architecture, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre, Brazil. I'm back with another video on architectural design. Its theme is the concept of character in architecture, which has long been absent from architectural debates. What follows is intended to argue that the concept of character is still important and that there are several types of characters that can be associated with a building or open space. A brief search on the internet for the term character shows the diversity of meanings and areas of knowledge in which it is the object of study. We find mentions of character as the sum of moral and psychological characteristics of a person, referring to persons in the theater, cinema, literature, etc., and even in relation to social networks. Messages on Twitter cannot exceed 280 characters. In architecture, the concept of character has its own meaning. In general, it can be said that the character of a building consists of a series of features that distinguish it from others. In the case of this project by Jean-Jacques Lequeux, its uniqueness is more evident by the use of unconventional elements. For the most of the last 2 centuries, in countries like England and France, architecture was believed to be determined by the interplay of composition and character. In addition, for a building to be considered of superior quality, it was essential that the presence of a correct composition and an adequate character be verified. In a simplified way, the notion of composition has to do with the two-dimensional and three-dimensional organization of a building, while the notion of character is linked to its meaning. Although many consider the concept of character obsolete and valid only for architectures prior to the 20th century, we will try to argue here that it is still valid and that it helps to understand the architecture of any time. The concept of composition will be the subject of a future video. The concept of character is complex and defies any absolute definition. Explicitly or implicitly, most of the architectural battles fought over the last 2 centuries had at their core the problem of the proper characterization of buildings. The 19th century was marked by the so-called Battle of Styles, in which the defenders of classical and Gothic architecture were on opposite sides, with the construction of the English Parliament being a focal point of this discussion, which was never fully resolved. Some questions immediately come to mind. Are there buildings without character, or that have a bad character? Is having character a quality, or could it not be? What constitutes the character of a building? Christian Norberg Schulz, writing in the 1960s, defined character as a dual concept, which refers to the general atmosphere of a building or place, but also to the form and material constitution of its parts. This is very important for those who design, since it indicates that the ways in which architecture is organized and built are decisive in defining its character. The following 3 pairs of images illustrate well how much the materiality of buildings and open spaces influences their characterization, as their formal structure is analogous. For Durand, the character of a building is closely linked to its distribution, that is, to the functional arrangement of the spaces in the most favorable way for the uses for which they are intended. Other authors relate the concept of character to the way a building relates to context and also to its volumetric organization. These two plans, taken from Durand's famous book, Précis des leçons données à l'école polytechnique, published in 1802, show two types of buildings and their relationship with external space. The building on the right, due to its convexity or its pavilion condition, does not configure the exterior space around it, while the one on the left generates patios by way of the interpenetration of its wings and exterior space. From this point on, I would like to establish a typology or classification of possible characters, each referring to one or more of the aspects mentioned above. It is important to emphasize that this classification is a device created so that the subject can be discussed more clearly. When one looks at projects and built works, which is what really matters, one will find various types of characters working together. The first would be immediate character, defined by the construction techniques and the materials used in it. Buildings that have a similar plan and volume, if they are built with different materials and techniques, concrete in the Brazilian example and steel and glass in the other, will have different characters on the purely physical plane. In the case of the next two buildings located in Venice, the use of stone and three-dimensional relief in the first case, and the greater flatness and opacity of the concrete in the second, support cultural meanings for sure, but can still be perceived for what they are as materials and design configuration. A second type would be the generic character, which is determined by the formal structure, which some prefer to call partie, following the Beaux-Arts tradition, and by the interior relationships that it determines, on one hand, and between the building and the context on the other. The character that arises from an order of spaces in sequence, ensuite, to use again the Beaux-Arts terminology, is quite different from the one determined by an organization in which a fluid space is modulated by freestanding planes. Two buildings based on the tower-on-base scheme help us clarify this issue. The general scheme is the same, but the treatment of the ground floor in the liver house, in which a very small amount of space is enclosed, determines that it's almost entirely public, while in the Brazilian example the ground floor is rather private, by virtue of enclosing all the available area. Opposing a patio organization to a linear plan is also instructive. In the Garcia Solera building, it can be said that the overall strategy interiorizes part of the exterior space. In the Ruffo house, you can only speak of front and back, conditions that do not alter the nature of the space. The relationship with the context is influenced by the number and size of the openings of a building, which affect their degree of permeability as well as by the material used. Buildings completely covered with reflective glass tend to disappear from their surroundings. The following buildings by José Antonio Coderc and Hélio Pignon occupy extremes in which the first is quite closed and the other is very permeable. With the Center for Primary Assistance by Jordi Badia in Spain as an intermediate solution in which the facade is open while protected with a layer of lattice work. The third component of this series is essential character, basically abstract, which consists of the psychological content that the work is capable of evoking: strangeness, infinity, variety, fantasy, serenity, simplicity, austerity, etc. The means used for this purpose are the proportions and dimensions of the building and the relationships between its parts. Boulez was one of the first to use this resource, proposing very large buildings, impossible to build at the time, in almost pure forms, to evoke sensations different from those provided by conventional architecture of the late 18th century. Boulez did not build any of these projects, but in the 20th century, some spaces were built that give us sensations similar to those sought by the French architect. In the second half of the 20th century, examples appeared in various parts of the world of an architecture that sought a greater permanence of the object by adopting an economy of means and a supposedly non-stylistic formal reticence, although they used formal resources inherited from architects such as Boulez and Ledoux. A less ambitious variant of the essential character is the adoption of design procedures intended to create visual interest. This procedure has a long tradition, from the English picturesque of the 18th and 19th centuries through abstract manipulations of the facades inspired by exercises carried out at the Bauhaus, until today, when most buildings are, in the words of Klaus Herdeg, attention-hungry objects that glorify their architects and owners while ignoring, if not damaging, their physical context. The fourth type of character is the programmatic, which is expressed in two ways. The first is quite literal and is already found in the work of Jean-Jacques Lequeux in the 18th century. Closer to our time, Robert Venturi showed in his book Learning from Las Vegas a poultry house shaped like a duct. From this, he developed the opposition between the duck and the decorated shed, so well known in the last decades of the 20th century. Another attitude, less literal, seems to express, through the use of some elements that represent the whole, the purpose for which the building is intended, such as this house for a person very fond of sailing. The second form of expression of the programmatic character transforms some essential components of a building into expressive elements, trying to reveal their function. One example of this could be the Michaeler House by Adolf Loos, where the two parts of the building are subtly articulated by the marble cladding that covers the commercial part. the top part being residential. More explicitly, James Stirling, in his university buildings of the 1960s and 70s, externalizes the circulation system and articulates the program by means of elementary composition. Piano and Rogers at the Pompidou Center and Eduardo Souto de Moura at the Viana do Castelo Cultural Center take mechanical systems outside as if to emphasize the fact that the control of their internal temperature was very high in the hierarchy of their needs. The fifth and last element of this tentative classification is what I would call associative character, defined as the use of conventional elements, more or less literal, that intend to carry out a character transposition, in which the new acquires meaning by association with a known object, existing or not, which is valued by a certain social group. This procedure has a long tradition, since in the 16th century Palladio gave the entrance porticos of his residence the shape of Greek temples, in order to emphasize the importance of those families in the local hierarchy, in association with what the historical precedent meant. In the case of his churches, in addition to the associated meaning, the use of the Greek temple helps to solve the dilemma of reconciling the central nave with the lower side naves. The search for associative character is at the center of the attempt at historical recovery that took place in the second half of the 20th century. Projects such as the Gardella building in Venice, Venturi's Mother House in Philadelphia, or Herzog and de Meuron concrete residence in Switzerland seek acceptance by adopting traditional types and elements. Although successful in some cases, this practice lost its meaning when the references became literal, leading to almost ridiculous situations. Even in modern architecture, in general opposed to the use of historical precedent, there are many examples in which traditional elements are interpreted and transformed, maintaining sufficient identity to be recognized. Possible examples of this are the residential buildings designed by Lúcio Costa for Guinle Park in Rio de Janeiro. Most of what was said before may seem like a way of complicating things, a fashionable habit in academia, where being obscure passes for erudition. But looking at design from the point of view of character makes sense if we pay attention to the fact that each building tells us something, and this communication stems directly from its spatial organization and the way it was built, that is to say, its generic and immediate characteristics. But the other types of characters are almost always present. The associative is inevitable. The appearance of a building always reminds us of some way of doing architecture, even when we imagine being abstract and non-stylistic. The programmatic character appears less frequently, since there is little direct correspondence between forms and uses. The essential character, on the other hand, is very subjective and fickle. The user does not always understand the intention of the architect. On other occasions, he or she relates the building or space to memories that are far from the original intention. Does it make sense to speak of adequate character at a time when there are no fixed rules for the practice of architecture and several design procedures coexist? Despite everything, architecture remains committed to facilitating the use it will serve and improving the places where it intervenes. If we accept this statement, how can we evaluate the design of this office building by Frank Gehry and the one for the Museum of Image and Sound by Diller Scofidio? Do they have a suitable character? Or in this case we can speak of bad character. At the very least, it can be said that the two buildings have a character alien to the spirit of the places for which they were proposed. They seem to be cases in which the project mistakenly assumes the personality of the authors instead of dialoguing with places that very clearly they did not understand. This is not the case with this project by the Spanish architect José María Sánchez García, who organizes the space around a Roman temple, allowing the historical building to be appreciated from various points of view, while creating a space for supporting activities to be carried out unobtrusively around it. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you liked it and that you return to attend others. All the best.